Dust swirled across the Route 66 truck stop as she stepped inside. Just another road-weary stranger in scuffed boots and a worn jacket. But when the ex-Marine at the door demanded her ID, the room went silent. One look at her badge, and every veteran in the place knew exactly who she was. What kind of past makes grown soldiers freeze? The Route 66 freight depot sat half a mile off the main highway, where the dust settled slow and the lights from the interstate faded into darkness. Its corrugated metal siding bore years of rust and sand scoring, like the shell of something that had weathered too many storms. Inside, the low rumble of idling diesel engines bled through the walls, mixing with the faint clink of coffee cups and the drone of a ball game playing from an old radio. It wasn't just a warehouse. It was a way station, a place where long-haul truckers swapped routes, veterans traded stories they'd never tell in daylight, and deals were made that never touched paper. Those who came here knew the rules. You kept your mouth shut, you minded your own, and you didn't ask questions about the men leaning in shadows or the unmarked trailers parked out back. That Thursday evening, the wind outside had teeth. Dust chased itself across the cracked asphalt lot, catching in the beams of headlights as rigs rolled in one by one. Robbie Dawson stood inside the entryway, a mountain of a man with squared shoulders and the posture of someone who'd spent half his life in uniform. The jagged scar that cut from his temple into his hairline gave away nothing about how he'd gotten it, and no one was foolish enough to ask. The front door swung open with a groan. A woman stepped inside, framed by the fading daylight. She wasn't dressed to impress. Battered leather jacket, sleeves creased from years of use, dark jeans dulled from dust, and boots whose soles had long since molded to the shape of her stride. Her hair, once chestnut, was sun-faded, tucked loosely under a cap with no logo. She didn't scan the room like a tourist. Her eyes moved slow, deliberate, cataloging exits, faces, and sight lines. Robbie's voice cut across the ambient noise. "Evenin'," he said, the single word thick with suspicion. "This ain't a truck stop for lost travelers. Let's see some ID." She didn't flinch. From her jacket pocket, she produced a laminated badge, the edges worn white from years of handling. Just the badge. She handed it to him without a word. Robbie took it, his expression still neutral. He read the name and something in his stance shifted. It wasn't fear exactly, but a subtle tightening around the eyes, a recalibration of posture. He'd heard that name before. The Ghost Registry. Most men who'd served overseas had heard whispers about it. A ledger of names that never made it into official records, belonging to operatives who had done things the government couldn't acknowledge. If you were on it, you didn't exist. And if you walked into a place like this, people noticed. A couple of veterans sitting at a corner table stopped mid-conversation. One, a wiry man with weathered hands, leaned toward the other. "That's her," he murmured. "The one from 91, Al-Sharif convoy." Took it apart without firing a shot. The rumor slid through the room like smoke, curling into the ears of those who knew what it meant and bouncing harmlessly off those who didn't. Robbie's fingers closed over the badge for a beat longer than necessary before he handed it back. "Go on in," he said, his voice lower now, more measured. But his hand drifted toward the radio clipped to his belt, thumb hovering near the transmit button. She took the badge, slipped it into her jacket, and stepped past him. Her boots made almost no sound on the worn floorboards. Heads turned slightly as she passed, but no one dared meet her eyes for long. Near the loading dock, a stack of pallets shifted as a trucker unloaded cargo, pretending to focus on his work while angling for a better look at her. A man playing solitaire at the counter shuffled his deck slower, his attention drifting toward the stranger who had just walked into their insulated little world. She didn't stop, didn't order coffee, didn't offer so much as a greeting. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone on a clock no one else could see. Robbie stayed at his post, watching her silhouette shrink into the deeper shadows of the depot. His grip on the radio loosened, but the thought lingered. If someone from the Ghost Registry was here, it wasn't by accident, and whatever brought her wasn't finished yet. The air inside the Route 66 freight depot carried a faint tang of motor oil, stale coffee, and something sharper, the metallic bite of secrecy. She moved as if she belonged here, though everyone's eyes said otherwise. Every step was deliberate, her gaze cutting across stacks of cargo, the high rafters, and the shadowed corners where old veterans sat with their backs to the wall. It was the kind of scan you didn't learn from a tourist map. This was pattern recognition, habit burned in by years of operating in places where a wrong turn could mean you never walked out. From the office at the far end of the main floor, Felix Mercer emerged. His presence was easy to spot, tall, still broad-shouldered despite his age, and carrying himself with the stiff, formal precision of someone who had worn rank for decades. Even in civilian clothes, dark slacks, pressed shirt, a weathered brown leather belt, there was no mistaking the military spine. "Ma'am," he called, voice steady but measured. "This is a restricted facility. You're not authorized to be in here without clearance." She stopped mid-stride, turning her head just enough to meet his eyes. "You think I walked in here by mistake?" Her tone was flat, the question rhetorical. Felix kept his face neutral, though his eyes flicked toward Robbie by the entrance. The guard gave the smallest shake of his head. "No trouble, not yet." "I'm asking you to leave," Felix pressed, stepping closer. "We run a clean operation here, and we don't need—" The sentence died in his throat when she reached into her jacket again. Slowly, deliberately, she flipped her badge in her palm, letting the worn plastic catch the overhead light. This time, her thumb shifted to reveal a small embossed seal in the lower corner, barely the size of a dime, but unmistakable to anyone who had spent time in certain corridors of the Pentagon. Delta-9. Felix's lips tightened, his eyes narrowing in a reflex of recognition. That seal wasn't just rare, it was almost mythical, a clearance code reserved for special operations so compartmentalized that most generals would never hear the name. A Delta-9 operative didn't need to explain themselves. They walked in, they got what they came for, and you prayed they didn't find your name in the wrong file. The pause between them stretched thin. In the background, the clatter of a dropped wrench from one of the maintenance bays seemed suddenly loud. Felix adjusted his stance, swallowing whatever argument he'd been about to make. "Follow me," he said finally. The command clipped but without its earlier authority. He led her down a side corridor, past the rows of clearly labeled freight, agricultural equipment, spare truck parts, sealed pallets of canned goods. The deeper they went, the quieter it got. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the air grew cooler, the smell of dust sharper. At the end of the hall stood a heavy steel door secured with a thick padlock. Felix produced a key from his pocket, hesitated for half a second as if considering whether to open it, then slid it into place. The lock clicked, and he swung the door open. Inside was a narrow storage bay, lit by a single flickering bulb. Here, the orderliness of the outer depot vanished. Crates were stacked unevenly, some marked with shipping codes, others with no markings at all. The few that were labeled carried names that didn't belong in a civilian freight house, military-grade abbreviations, cryptic lot numbers, and in one case, a stencil in Arabic script beneath the English, Al-Sawad Industries. She stepped inside without hesitation, pulling a small, weathered notebook from her jacket. The spine was cracked, the cover blotched with faint water stains. She began jotting notes quickly, pausing now and then to brush her fingertips over the rough wood of a crate as if committing the feel of it to memory. Her pen stopped over the stenciled manufacturer's name, pressing harder into the paper. Felix leaned against the doorframe, watching her with the tense stillness of a man trying to anticipate the next move on a board he didn't realize he'd been playing. "You know what those are?" he asked finally. She didn't look up. "I know enough to understand they're not in your manifest." Meanwhile, in the main corridor outside, a young driver named Michael Alvarez was sweeping the floor near the loading bay. Barely 24, Michael was new to the depot, still carrying that mix of respect and wariness for the older veterans who ran the place. But his ears caught fragments of Felix's low voice, then hers, steady and unyielding. Words like manifest and Delta-9 made the broom pause mid-sweep. Michael knew better than to stick his nose where it didn't belong. Around here, curiosity could get you frozen out of routes or worse. But something about the stranger's calm, her total lack of hesitation in a place that made outsiders flinch, it gnawed at him. Quietly, He set the broom aside and followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows along the corridor. He stopped just before the open doorway, close enough to hear the scrape of her pen, the rustle of paper. Inside, she closed her notebook with a soft thud, slipping it back into her jacket. "This doesn't leave here," she said, her voice still level but edged now. Felix's gaze didn't waver. "Depends on what this is." She stepped past him without answering, her boots clicking softly on the concrete. Felix watched her go, the steel door swinging shut between them. Michael stayed frozen in place until her footsteps faded into the hum of the main floor. Then he glanced back toward the bay where the padlocked door stood, his pulse ticking faster. He didn't know who she was or what Delta-9 meant, but he knew one thing. Whatever she had come for, it was bigger than this depot. And now he was part of it, whether he wanted to be or not. By the time the first strip of pale light slipped over the horizon, the Route 66 freight depot had gone unnaturally quiet. The steady thrum of conversation that usually greeted dawn was gone. No clinking coffee mugs, no low hum of radios. Even the veteran mechanics in the back bays worked in silence, as though a pressure had settled over the place in the night. She stepped out of the shadowed corridor and into the office. The space smelled faintly of stale paper and cigarette smoke, with ledgers stacked high on the desk and a wall calendar still pinned open to a month 3 years past. Felix Mercer stood behind the desk, shoulders squared but eyes betraying the long night he'd had. The battered notebook was no longer in her hand. "The report's gone," she said, her voice flat, stripped of anything resembling surprise. "But I remember every word." Felix didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted toward the file cabinet in the corner, its drawers locked tight. If she noticed, she gave no sign. Outside the office windows, a line of diesel rigs idled in the lot, exhaust curling into the cold morning air. Their chrome bumpers caught the sun in brief flashes, but the drivers stayed inside their cabs, waiting for clearance. The normal rhythm, check-in, paperwork, dispatch, had been replaced by stillness. Down by the loading bay, Robbie Dawson spotted movement out of the corner of his eye. Michael Alvarez was easing toward the side exit, his shoulders hunched, an envelope tucked tightly under his arm. He moved like a man who didn't want to be noticed, which, in Robbie's world, meant you definitely noticed him. "Michael," Robbie called, his voice carrying enough weight to freeze the younger man mid-step. Michael turned slowly, trying to force a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just grabbing something from my truck." Robbie walked toward him with the deliberate pace of someone who didn't need to rush to get answers. "What's in the envelope?" "It's nothing," Michael said too quickly, holding it tighter. Robbie's hand came up, palm open. Michael hesitated, then reluctantly handed it over. The thick paper was sealed, the edges worn from handling. Robbie cracked it open and slid the contents free. A stack of folded shipment manifests, their columns of typed text interrupted by handwritten notes in the margins. Even without context, Robbie could tell these weren't the sanitized copies drivers usually saw. The codes, the destination points, the discrepancies in cargo descriptions, this was proof. Not rumors, not whispers. Proof that shipments with foreign arms and unlisted cargo had been moving through the depot under legitimate covers. Robbie's eyes narrowed. "Where'd you get these?" Michael shifted uncomfortably. "They were lying out. I heard them talking last night about manifests that didn't match. I thought maybe... You thought maybe you'd play hero." Robbie's voice was sharp, but underneath it was something else. Concern. Outside, a dark SUV that hadn't been there earlier idled near the far edge of the lot. Windows tinted, engine humming low. Robbie caught it in his peripheral vision, made a mental note, but said nothing. Too many unknowns already. From the office doorway, she appeared, silent as ever. Her gaze dropped to the papers in Robbie's hands, then rose to meet Michael's. "Those are mine," she said. Michael swallowed. "You dropped the notebook." "I figured." "I didn't drop anything," she cut in. "I left it where I meant to, and now I know who's willing to move it around." Felix emerged from behind her, his expression carefully neutral. "We can discuss this inside," he said, gesturing toward the office. She ignored him, plucking the top sheet from Robbie's hand. Her eyes scanned the page quickly, lips tightening at certain entries. These aren't just bad manifests. Look at the dates, they're coded. Swap the month and day, and they match the timeline of 3 separate Gulf shipments in '91. She tapped a line near the bottom. And this call sign, Raven 7. That was scratched into the side of a crate in your locked room, Mercer. Felix stiffened. You think you're the only one who's noticed? We've been trying to get a handle on this without blowing the place wide open. You don't just walk into a community like this and start. If I'm here, she said sharply, someone already suspects. And if they send the others, you won't have time to explain anything. Michael glanced between them, his grip tightening on the remaining papers Robbie still held. He could feel the weight of every veteran's gaze in this building. Men and women who had given him work when no one else would, who had trusted him with their freight, their stories, their silences. But now he knew, and knowing meant choosing. He thought of the day 6 months ago when his rig broke down outside Tulsa. 3 hours stranded, engine fried. It was Robbie who pulled over, gave him a tow, and covered the repair bill when Michael couldn't. You look like someone who just needs a break, he'd said. That debt still sat heavy on Michael's conscience. Expose the truth, and he'd betray the people who had taken him in. Keep quiet, and he'd help bury evidence that could bring the whole operation down. Robbie watched him closely, reading the war on his face. The rigs in the lot kept idling, their diesel engines sending steady vibrations through the concrete floor. The sound filled the space between words like a ticking clock. She turned toward the door. Decide quickly, Alvarez, because when I leave, the choice leaves with me. Michael's jaw worked as he stared at the envelope in Robbie's hand. Somewhere outside, an air brake hissed, a reminder that time, like the truth, wasn't going to wait. The first true light of morning bled across the Route 66 asphalt, turning the cracked blacktop to pale gold. But unlike most mornings at the depot, there was no rumble of early freight being dispatched, no chatter from drivers swapping gossip before hitting the road. The lot stood eerily empty. Every rig that had idled in line before dawn was gone, leaving behind only faint tire marks in the dust and the slow drip of condensation from the roof. Inside, the vast space of the warehouse felt even larger without the noise. The shadows clung stubbornly to the high rafters, the smell of diesel hanging like a memory. Crates that hours ago had been stacked loosely were now neatly sealed, their edges reinforced with fresh bands of steel strap. Even the ones marked with foreign manufacturers' names sat in perfect order, like obedient soldiers waiting for inspection. Felix Mercer stood at the threshold of the secured storage bay, the heavy padlock in his hand. His eyes moved over the rows of crates as if expecting to find one missing, but every last one was accounted for. Only the air felt different, lighter, and yet charged with something that wouldn't settle. On the counter in the front office it sat, the badge, battered, sun-faded, its laminated edges still curling slightly. Robbie Dawson stepped inside and stopped when he saw it. He approached slowly, the weight of recognition pressing down with each step. He picked it up, turning it over in his palm. On the back, etched faintly but unmistakably, were the words, "When they forget, I return." Robbie closed his hand around it and slid it into his jacket pocket without a word. He didn't need to tell Felix what it meant. The former colonel already knew. Felix's jaw tightened as he locked the steel door on the storage yard. The click of the padlock echoed in the silence, final in sound but hollow in meaning. No lock could keep out someone like her. Still, the gesture gave him the illusion of control, and that was enough for now. The veterans who had been in the depot last night said nothing to each other about her. They didn't need to. Those who recognized her name from whispered stories understood the badge wasn't a warning. It was a promise that if she came back, it wouldn't be for idle conversation. By midday, the depot was back to its usual rhythm. A couple of local haulers pulled in. A delivery of spare tires rolled off a flatbed, and Felix buried himself in paperwork. Robbie went about his rounds, his jacket zipped tight against the chill, his hand occasionally brushing the badge in his pocket like a talisman. Miles down the road, Michael Alvarez eased his rig into a gravel lot beside a roadside diner. The sign above the awning buzzed faintly, one of its neon letters flickering in the bright daylight. The place was the kind of stop that smelled of bacon grease and brewed coffee before you even stepped inside. Michael killed the engine and leaned back in the seat, trying to shake the heaviness that had clung to him since dawn. He'd replayed the morning over and over, Robbie catching him with the envelope, her eyes pinning him like a spotlight, the choice she'd left hanging in the air. He didn't know if he'd made it yet. As he reached for his jacket from the passenger seat, something caught his eye. A slip of paper, folded neatly, was tucked into the side pocket. He froze. He hadn't put it there. Heart thudding, he pulled it free. The paper was plain, creased once down the middle, the kind you could find in any office supply store. But when he unfolded it, his stomach tightened. It wasn't just a note, it was a list. Names. Some he recognized immediately. Drivers who'd been in and out of the depot for years. Veterans he'd shared coffee with. Others were unfamiliar, but beside each was a single letter or number in tight, precise handwriting. The kind of code that looked meaningless to the wrong eyes and perfectly clear to the right ones. At the bottom, one final line stood apart from the rest. Choose which side you're on before they choose for you. There was no signature. None was needed. Michael sat in the cab for a long moment, the diner's neon sign flickering in his peripheral vision. Outside, a couple of locals climbed into their pickups and drove off, dust trailing behind them. He looked again at the list, his mind spinning. If these names meant what he thought they did, then this wasn't over, not for the depot, not for Felix, and not for him. Folding the paper carefully, he slipped it back into his jacket. He wasn't ready to decide. Not yet. But he knew one thing. Whatever choice he made, it would follow him for the rest of his life. Back at the Route 66 freight depot, Robbie stood in the doorway of the storage bay, staring at the locked crates. His hand drifted again to the badge in his pocket, and he thought about those etched words. When they forget, I return. Below the inscription, in a line even smaller and nearly worn away, was a single word, kite. A call sign, not a name, one whispered in briefings where no recordings were allowed. Robbie stared at it a moment longer before slipping the badge into his pocket. Some part of him wondered if they'd ever get the chance to forget. Some pasts don't fade. They wait in silence until the right moment to resurface. And when they do, they never come alone. This story makes us question, how much of what we see is really all there is? If you were Michael, would you keep her secret or bring the truth into the light? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more stories like this. See you in the next video.